Hi, and welcome to another episode of The Path of Longevity. I'm your host, Dr. Stephen Sideroff, and I'm joined by my co-host, Dr. Robert Lufkin. Rob?
Hey, Steve, it's good to see you. I'm so excited about our episode today. We have Nayiri Mississian, who is a podcast host. She does the Low Carbo Dieting podcast, and also she is a Type One Diabetic who was told, given the medical advice to eat whatever you want, just cover it with insulin, as so many people are unfortunately told. And let's find out what she did about that. Hey, Nayiri, welcome to the show.
Hello, everyone. Hello, Steve. Hello, Dr. Lufkin. Thank you, sir. Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, yeah. Please call me Rob. It's so great to have you here. Maybe before we talk about all these interesting things, maybe you could just fill us in a little bit about your background and how you came to be interested in this particular area.
Okay, so actually this week I'm Type 1 diabetic for 45 years. So all of last year I kept saying 44, so I had to remind myself that earlier on to say 45. I'm 45 years of I've lived with Type 1 diabetes 45 years. Well, my blood sugar control was horrible despite all my efforts, because I followed the ADA guidelines, which the UK-based ones are very similar to the American guidelines, and basically the idea was, as a Type 1 diabetic, you don't have to limit your carbohydrates, you don't have to follow a special diet, you just eat normal foods like everyone else, and your HbA1c, don't expect it to be like a non-diabetic, because that's just not heard of. And so they said, they don't set the bar high for you. They don't tell you there is an option of not eating carbohydrates. And so that's how I lived until my blood sugars were completely out of control. My health was suffering. My education background is linguistics, and I've been an educator for close to 30 years. And I started taking time off teaching and devoting time to nutrition research. And throughout my research, I actually found out about Jason Fung. And I got more and more into Jason Fung. Was the first video actually I accidentally saw online, and that really intrigued me. And I've been doing serious Type 1 research and experiments on myself since 2015, I would say. I write blogs on Type 1 diabetes and extended fasting, which is quite unique. And I do also coaching. I love working with Type 1 diabetics because it's so sad for me to find out or to hear from them that I'm in the same situation. I'm not receiving any support from my clinicians. And they're not receiving any support, and they want to try fasting. They want to try reducing their carbs, and they just need that community support. So I've set up a small community for us on Facebook. There are a few hundreds of us who are doing keto. So we're following the ketogenic diet, but we're also faster. So we do the occasional fasting for longevity on autophagy and all the other benefits. And we prove the medical world, wrong. We show the world that as a Type 1, you can do fasting and you can do it safely. You can do it with the tools, especially with the tools available to us these days. So I almost sound like I have a chip on my shoulder, as we're saying in the UK. I want to show the world that there is no reason why you cannot do extended fasting if you wanted to, just because you're Type 1. I'm not saying it's something every person should do or every Type 1 diabetic should do, but if you wanted to do it, what's stopping you?
Let me do a quick follow-up question too for our audience. Maybe just the background, maybe you could explain the difference between Type 1 and Type 2 diabetes, and also maybe tell us why the advice that the American Diabetic Association gives you and the UK Diabetic Association gives type 1 diabetics, that they can eat whatever they want, just cover it with insulin dosage. Why that advice is so dangerous and unhealthy.
Right. Okay. So, quick definition of type 2 and type 1. Now, with type 2 diabetes is the most common form of diabetes that there is today. So, when you tell someone I'm diabetic, the first question is, have you been eating the wrong types of food, or is it genetic? Did your family, are they diabetic as well? So they're all talking, of course, they're referring to type 2 diabetes. Type 2 diabetes it does have a genetic component, as we know. There is a small genetic component there. Of course, there is a genetic predisposition. Let me just rephrase myself. But it is primarily metabolic problem. It is primarily a lifestyle problem. So, with most type 2 diabetics, apart from the minority who LADA, but we'll leave that to one side. So the majority of type 2 diabetics are insulin resistant, which means that for 10 or 15 years, their insulin they've been hyperinsulinemic. In other words, their insulin has run so high in order to control their blood sugars, to keep their blood sugar in check, that their cells, or some of the cells in some parts of their body, have now become resistant to insulin. And so it doesn't make sense to me that they do have insulin abundantly on board. It's just that their body is not responding to it. It's a bit like taking, people who are addicted to painkillers, right? You take painkillers every single day, whether you're in pain or not, you take it for its psychological comfort, and then you find yourself addicted to it. One day you find yourself, suffering a migraine. You go to your doctor. It actually happened. This is a true story. It happened to one of my friends. And she went to the doctor, and doctor said, oh, take this, couple of paracetamol tablets. And she was like, but I take that daily, and I take it morning, noon, and evening. It doesn't do anything. Well, of course it wouldn't, because now you're resistant to it, or your body's become more tolerant of it. Same happens with insulin. So, so I think the best therapeutic way to treat type 2 diabetes is, instead of giving a type 2 diabetic person more insulin, and I'll talk later on why insulin is not always the answer, just to tell them, hey, reduce your carbohydrates, and your body will then produce less insulin. And when it starts producing less and less insulin, your cells will actually become responsive to insulin again. And this is called putting your type 2 diabetes into remission, which is something we're hearing more and more of these days. We know it's done. We're seeing it all over the world. Type 2 diabetics, with or without their physician support, are putting their type 2 diabetes into remission by reducing carbohydrates. Because when you reduce carbohydrates, you then gradually become responsive to the insulin that your pancreas is already producing. It has been producing all along. So now, type 1 diabetes is not a condition of insulin overabundance, but it's actually a condition of insulin insufficiency. Now, with type 1 diabetics, the beta cells in the pancreas that produce insulin are damaged. It's an autoimmune condition. So we don't know what triggers one's autoimmune system to actually destroy their own pancreatic cells that produce insulin. But this is what happens in type 1 diabetics. I was 5 years old when I was diagnosed, all of a sudden. So my pancreas doesn't produce enough insulin. if at all, to keep me alive. I mean, insulin is an important hormone without which we wouldn't be alive. So without insulin, I wear an insulin pump. Some other type 1 diabetics have to take insulin injections daily. Without that, we would probably only live about a month or two, if that. So, so for us, we don't have any insulin on board. So we need that baseline insulin, a certain level of insulin to keep our body functioning. So that's the difference between type 1 and type 2. I hope that was clear enough.
Yeah, very, very clear. I'm curious. I actually have some clients who have type 1 diabetes, and one of the things that I find pretty common with them is anxiety in terms of their kind of continual monitoring of levels and an anxiety that they're going to fall outside of the range. Is that an experience that you've seen in the people that you've worked with?
I suffered anxiety. And for me, the cause of my anxiety was not necessarily diabetes itself or the condition that I was having to live with, but the annual visits to my diabetes clinic. I hated those visits. I dreaded those visits because every time I went there and my blood sugar wasn't in good control, despite all my efforts, in fact, extreme efforts, but without the proper guidance, I just couldn't do it, couldn't keep it under control. And the implication was that, Nayiri, you're not doing well. So, so the blame was on me. I actually would go to the clinic for my annual checkup or whatever, and I just dread the moment my name would be called. I just didn't want to go there because I had nothing to say to them. Look, my HbA1c is just stuck at 7.8. In fact, it used to be higher, like 9.9. I've got the conversions here. So 9.8 is what I remember. That's 84 millimoles over a liter. So that's pretty high. 9.8% is a very high HbA1c. But and they would tell me I'm not doing well enough. They would tell me I'm not using all the options on my pump, insulin pump. I've mentioned this in one of my podcasts before, but one day my diabetes specialist nurse, who was looking at all my blood sugars, because I would have to keep a manual record before the CGM. She told me, pardon me, she told me, Nayiri, you have, so you've eaten that pizza, and you know, you have to be more smart taking insulin for that pizza. Maybe you should split your insulin injection. Maybe you should take 20% of it 30 minutes before you eat the pizza. And then while you're eating, take another, I don't know, the rest of the other 20%, and take the remaining 1 hour after you've eaten. Try out different formulas. And you're not being, in fact, these are her words. She said, you're not being proactive enough. And I've hated the word proactive since then. I have not used the word proactive. I've joked about it when I use the word, or I hear anyone say proactive. Oh my goodness, it brings anxiety to me. It's the worst feeling when you make someone feel useless, that they're a failure. They're having to live with a disease which is difficult to control, and the implication that it's their fault that they're not able to control it. And you're not telling them, remove the carbohydrates and you're going to have flat lines, which I do now. But instead of giving me advice that works, they would just teach me different so-called smart ways to take my insulin to cover the 100 grams of sugar I've just ingested from a pizza or a pasta dish. That's a lot of sugar. That is not something any type 1 can. There might be some really genius type ones out there who are doing a good job on a high carb diet, but I certainly couldn't. Those were the times that I would feel anxiety. And I think what I love about eating low carbohydrate or eating a sort of ketogenic way now is that at least one variable, which is the diet, that has an impact on blood sugars, at least I've got that under control. The other variables are, with women's monthly cycle. Well, I have no control over that one. That comes and goes every month. I can't control that one. Other hormones I can't control. For example, sleep has impact on blood sugars. And that is something I can control. And I do my very best to get my good quality 8 hours sleep every single night. I go to bed early and I don't compromise my sleep no matter what. So exercise, for example, has an impact on blood sugars, and I approach it wisely. So I anticipate blood sugar rises depending on the type of exercise, or drops. So I go to my exercise prepared. So all these elements that have an impact on blood sugar, if I can have some kind of control over those, then I do, to make life easier on me. This is why I do the low carb sort of way of eating, because all those elements I mentioned, from exercise to sleep to stress, etc., all of those have an impact on blood sugars. But the biggest element, the biggest player of them all, is your diet. And so if I can control that somehow, then I've won the game. Really. I mean, I've got my diabetes under control. It doesn't mean that, I'm never going to have any fluctuations. I'm never going to have, I've got everything under control. And now manually, I'm somehow able to replicate non-diabetics working pancreas. Well, no, not really. I mean, I do get highs and lows every now and again, but at least I know that they're not drastic. They're not severe. That I'm not going to need anyone when I go to bed. I can sleep well without worrying that, I might actually drop into some severe hypoglycemia and need someone's support. I've been in those situations before when I used to be on a high carb diet, because high carbohydrate diet requires a lot of insulin. When you're taking massive doses of insulin, a crash is inevitable. Your blood sugars are going to crash. So when they're going to crash, you're shaking, you're dizzy, and you're hungry. You're ravenously hungry, so you just want to eat again. And you don't want to eat steak or broccoli. You want to eat carbohydrates again to raise your blood sugar back up. And so you eat carbohydrates, and then they rise right up, they shoot up, and then after every rise, there is a drop, and then a rise and a drop, and it's just a nightmare to live with. If that doesn't cause anxiety on its own, on anyone, diabetic or not, or I don't know what does. But blood sugars are closely related. Correct me on that if I'm wrong, Stephen, but from my understanding is that blood sugar fluctuations are closely related to mood swings and feeling of hangry, as they said, or hunger and anger combined.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things you're pointing out is that if your provider approached you differently by giving you more support rather than their approach, you'd be less anxious. You might have be calmer, and that may make a difference with how you're dealing with your diabetes. And I'm wondering, have you thought about what is your thinking about how stress plays a role in symptoms and regulating? Because my belief is that you want to do whatever you can to self-regulate so that you need less external intervention to maintain balance.
Well, stress, when cortisol is high, I notice as a type 1 diabetic, because I have to take my insulin exogenously. A non-diabetic person wouldn't see this. I've always said I don't want to undermine type 1 diabetes. It is a serious condition, or it can be a serious condition. But if there is ever one good side to type 1, hey, let's look at the good side. You can see exactly how much insulin you're taking and how and when and how much you're needing. So you actually can see, you have full control over your insulin. If you want to look at the good side of it, there is a good side to it. So so I noticed that, for example, if I haven't had a good sleep, if I've had a disturbed sleep, too much thinking, too many thoughts in my head, and I'm not necessarily saying I haven't slept well enough, but I've had a disturbed sleep. So even when I sleep long, like 9 hours in bed, if the sleep wasn't quality sleep, then I notice it the next morning, or the next day, up until lunchtime, for example. If I have something to eat, I'm going to need twice as much insulin for it, because I am temporarily insulin resistant. And that's because of the stress, because the previous night I didn't sleep very well. Also, stress during resistance training, which is what I do. I engage in resistance training at least five days a week. And if I'm stressing my body, stressing the muscles, I'm going to have a blood sugar rise. And that's expected, because cortisol rises, and with it, insulin needs rise. Again, I mean, none of these are things that we cannot control. I work with a lot of type 1s, and when they say, but how do you make sure you sleep well? I just, I tell them, look, I just give them a few tips about, switching everything off, all your devices off, don't have a TV in your room, just keep your room cool. And you have to prioritize your sleep. Sleep is important. Exercise, how do you avoid extreme highs? If you're rising a little bit high within sort of relatively normal range, it's fine. But what happens to me, for example, maybe it's because I'm a perimenopausal woman, hormones also play a role, but I rise incredibly high during resistance training. So I actually do have to take a little bit of insulin to sort of curb that rise. But if my blood sugars only rose up to, I don't know, let me just look at my conversion. So it rose up to, say, 7 in millimoles over a liter. So that's in your measurements, that'll be about 83, 85. So I wouldn't necessarily do anything, but mine really do go right up to 130, 140 during exercise. So I take a little bit of insulin. I'm not saying it's easy to manage blood sugars, to keep them under control if you are type 1. But with confidence, and with the right mindset, approaching it as something that you can control, having that belief in your head that I'm going to control this. I may not be able to control everything all of the time, but if I can control most of the elements most of the time, that's good enough for me. So it's that mindset. You're not going to win the battle over it. You're going to have highs, you're going to have lows every now and again, but approach it with confidence and don't let it defeat you. You have control over it. You can control many of the elements that I've mentioned, like sleep. Prioritize your sleep. It's important. I don't know why you would, sit there and watch another episode on Netflix after 10 p.m. when you know how important sleep is for you. Just try and get into the habit of sleeping, prioritizing it. Prioritizing your diet is another one. A lot of people spend time on doing other things. And I look at their daily activities and I go, but those 2 hours were kind of wasted. You could have watched your favorite show, but you could have cooked at the same time. So that would have been like the dinner prepared at home. So I find it astonishing that, I actually have to point these things out to some of the people I work with. And then they go, oh, Nayiri, that was clever. Like, there was nothing clever in it. There's truly nothing clever in it. But some people need that confidence, need an extra pair of hands to look at a pair of eyes rather, to have a look at what they're doing and where they can tweak things and make it work better for them.
Yeah, let me see if I understand this then. Blood sugar levels or blood glucose levels will spike, and that is something to be avoided in diabetics, either type 1 or type 2 diabetics. It's also to be avoided in regular people, because even if you're not diabetic, we now know those blood sugar spikes drive all the chronic diseases and aging itself. So certain foods create these spikes, particularly you mentioned carbohydrates, whereas fats and proteins less so. So there's one type of food that makes these unfortunate things, these bad, harmful things happen in our bodies. Now, the advice you were given was, or the choice that you make as a diabetic, if you have these spikes, you have to take insulin to control it, let's say. So you could either have the choice of taking the insulin and eating carbohydrates, or just not having carbohydrates and not using additional insulin to control the spikes. So why does anyone choose to inject a needle? What is it about carbohydrates that makes people want them so badly that they're willing to inject themselves or, get premature aging and everything for it?
2 parts to your question, Rob. You started with the exercise. Well, most aerobic exercises like walking, cycling, swimming will lower blood glucose. This is why we tell people, diabetic or not, the best thing you can do is, after you've had your dinner or a massive meal or lunch, go out for a walk. Go for a walk for 30 minutes, because that helps burn some of the blood sugars. So this is what happens to type 1s as well. So if I've had a meal and I'm going up for a walk, I expect a drop. And because my body cannot regulate its own blood sugars, I have to regulate it myself. I go out for a walk prepared. If I have to go out for a walk, if I have to go swimming, cycling, whatever, I'm always prepared. I obviously have my CGM with me, but before the CGM, this monitors my blood sugars, or rather the blood glucose in the interstitial fluid, not in the blood. So, but again, it's a similar thing. So it monitors it continuously. But before I had this, I would use the normal glucometer, which most people have these days at home. They're affordable. You can find them anywhere from, drugstores to supermarkets. I would have that with me. So you need to be on top of this. You can't just go out for a walk and assume that nothing will happen, or a 2-hour bike ride and assume that nothing will happen, especially if you're type 1. If you're not type 1, it's a great way to burn extra glucose. Go out and, and you can trust your pancreas to do its job, and to do that beautiful play between glucagon and insulin. But we don't have that luxury. So we have to go out prepared when we're engaging in any aerobic exercise. So when I'm going out on a bike ride, for example, I have to make sure my CGM with me. I use my phone to scan my blood sugars. And so my phone is fully charged. And I have to take glucose tablets with me. These are the dextrose tablets. So I have to carry them in my pocket too, just in case I'm too low and I may need a glucose tablet or 2. to bring my blood sugars back up again. But other than that, I'm fine. I wear an insulin pump. So that means that if I need insulin, I use this device to just using the buttons. I tell this device, this is a PDM, so I tell the PDM how much insulin to pump into me. But my insulin pump is very similar to my CGM, just a little bit larger, and it contains insulin enough for 3 days in it, and I have to change it every 3 days. But if you're not taking that and you're taking manual injections with the insulin pens or the disposable syringes, again, go out prepared. Take everything you might need with you. Extra insulin, which is unlikely, but you know, who knows? Take the extra insulin with you, or take your insulin pen, which is what most people use these days, and take your glucose tablets. The most important thing is your glucose tablets, because you are expected to drop low. If any type 1s are listening to me now, and you're wearing a pump like me, it's actually a privileged position, because what I can do on the pump is I can stop insulin, because the pump is set up so that it to replicate a normal working pancreas, by giving me every 15 minutes a certain dose of insulin as my baseline insulin levels to keep me alive, right? So what I do is, if I notice my blood sugars dropping, I go, depending on how low they're dropping, I go, shall I take an insulin tablet now, or shall I completely suspend the pump? Because that's an option. Pump users have that option. So I can, in fact, most of the time I suspend. I just don't want the glucose tablet unnecessarily. I just suspend the pump for about half an hour, and then I notice, oh, my blood sugar's back up to normal again. So that's another strategy that I use. So if any pump users out there are listening, so it's an option. Every pump provides, this is the Omnipod, but all pumps have that suspend option. So that's for aerobic exercises. For resistance training, most people will notice a slight rise, diabetic or not, and it is physiologically normal response when blood sugars rise. So if they're not rising above 7, for example, in millimoles over liters, in milligrams over deciliters, it's about 126. So they're not rising above 126 or 130, then you're fine. You don't need to do anything, but mine actually do rise right up. So I have to take small dose of insulin during exercise, so that they're not rising to crazy levels, crazy high levels. Now, the second part of your question was about why they don't advise lower carbohydrate diets, right? I think they're all afraid of hypoglycemic events, because, which kind of makes sense, because if someone is eating a high carbohydrate diet, right? If you've just sat down and eaten a whole meal of pasta and a side salad and grilled chicken or whatever it may be, these were the meals that I've had for years, right? And I would calculate the carbohydrates. In a full plate of pasta, for example, there would easily be about 80 grams of carbohydrates. That's 80 grams of carbohydrates. I would then have some kind of a dessert, and because I was always health conscious, I would have a bowl of fresh fruits because of course fruit is good for us, right? All that sugar is good for us. I wouldn't have I'd never have, I always cooked at home, so I wouldn't have other desserts, but I would have fruit, because I was under the impression that, yeah, fruit is good. It's good for us. So then I would have another like 60 or 50 or 60 grams of carbohydrates from a bowl of fruit. So that's a lot of carbohydrates in one meal, right? To cover those carbohydrates with insulin, I would need a high, really high dose of insulin. I can't even remember. I can't do the calculation now in my head. I've forgotten how I used to do the calculation. But anyone, who is eating that many carbohydrates is going to need a massive amount of insulin. When you're taking a large amount of insulin, it's suddenly at the 30-minute sort of mark, it's going to start peaking and your blood sugars are going to start dropping. But before insulin starts working, all those sugars are already started sort of being digested and getting into your bloodstream. So your blood sugar is rising, and then insulin starts peaking, and then an hour later, insulin is absolutely working efficiently. So your blood sugars will drop, sharp drop. As they're dropping sharply, you're going to want to eat more carbohydrates again. Whether you're feeling hungry or not, you're actually feeling like dizzy and hypoglycemic. So you want to eat carbohydrates again. So the problem with a carbohydrate-based diet, I'm not necessarily saying high carbohydrate, but carb-based diet, is that you're going to need large doses of insulin. When you have large doses of insulin, it's very difficult to gauge exactly at what point the carbohydrate you've ingested is going to turn into blood glucose, right? Because some carbohydrates take longer to digest. And for example, I don't know, pasta might take a little bit longer than a table sugar, right? Table sugar is really quick. So the lentils might take much more longer. They're very fibrous, so they're more complex carbs. They take longer, but it's extremely difficult to know when, at what point to take your insulin to avoid blood sugars rising dangerously high. So you're playing a game that you will not win. And you play the same game over and over again. It gets very disheartening, Stephen, like you were asking about anxiety. It gets so disheartening at the end, and you go, this disease will control this disease is controlling me. I can't, how am I going to live the rest of my life with it? Because you're not going to win that battle. You're taking a large dose of insulin, and you have no idea at what point your meal is going to turn into glucose in your body. You just can't time it. You can't time it. It's impossible. So the advantage of a lower carbohydrate diet is that because your carbohydrates are so low, so you're taking small doses of insulin. Dr. Bernstein calls it the game, or the law of small numbers, because you're playing with small numbers. So you're taking a small dose of insulin to cover the small amount of carbohydrates. And if you have a drop, it's going to be not a sharp drop, but it's just going to be a small drop. And then if you have a rise, it's going to be a small rise and a small drop. So your fluctuations are actually in a tight or narrow range when you reduce your carbohydrates. And that gives me hope. That changes the way you look at your diabetes completely. It gives you hope. As to why some people don't want to try it, I think that was something, that was another of your questions. I think not knowing if they're not supported by their diabetes team, or diabetes clinic, they won't have the confidence to do it alone, because you will need to reduce your insulin. So, and that's a serious thing. Not many people have the confidence. Not many people have the tools, for example, that I have, CGM and an insulin pump where I can play with all the buttons and I can just control it. They won't necessarily have the technology. They won't have the support of their clinicians. But also, and I've found that through my coaching, some people have serious food addiction problems. They worry about reducing carbohydrates or eliminating carbs because they know they cannot, or they won't be able to. So it's something, if someone tells me you're going to climb that mountain. I look at the mountain. Hey, how much mountain climbing experience I have? None. So I go, oh, I'm not going to do well. So no, thanks for the offer, but no, I'm not coming. I'm not joining you because I will not succeed. Right. So that's how they look at it. They know people, whether they admit it or not, whether they've been screened for it or not. A lot of people are addicted to carbohydrates. And so it will be very difficult for them to give them up. So that's another reason I believe some people may not want to consider this option.
In the last few minutes, Nayiri, maybe you could tell us a little bit about your program and what people experience in that.
Okay, so I offer coaching services. I help. My area of research is diabetes. So I am passionate about diabetes and helping diabetics because in my family, type 2 diabetes runs rampant. A lot of my family members are type 2 diabetics. So, and you know, I worry about developing type 2 diabetes on top of my type 1 diabetes. As I said, I mean, the two, one can be both, and it's actually called double diabetes. So I worry about being double diabetic. I mean, type 1 is bad enough. It's not bad enough, but you know, it's enough to deal with. I don't want to become insulin resistant and hence type 2 diabetic as well. So, but I'm passionate about diabetes, particularly type 1 diabetes, because we are not receiving, type 1 diabetics around the world are not receiving the required help from their physicians. Type 2 diabetics now are in a better positions in that respect. They are now, at least some type 2 diabetics are receiving help and support from their physicians. Type 1s are not. So I have a group on Facebook for type 1 diabetics who are already on keto and who do fasting as well. So we contact each other. We have chats as well, group chats. So we support each other. We tell each other how we're doing it and, you know, how to keep yourself safe, because people will do it. If we don't support each other, people are just going to do it on their own. And it's important because it can be dangerous. This isn't a game. It can be life-threatening if your insulin isn't adjusted appropriately when you're fasting, for example, right? When you're going on a 5-day fast and you're not reducing your insulin, or you're reducing it too much, you could definitely fall into DKA, diabetic ketoacidosis, which is another life-threatening condition. So this isn't a game. So we've found that if we can support each other, give each other tips, then we can empower the community members to try and do it for themselves. So anyone who's type 1, feel free to get in touch with me. I'm always here to help, and join the group as well.
Great. What is the best way for people to reach you on social media and maybe your website also?
Okay, so the website is lowcarbonfasting.com. If you go to the website, lowcarbonfasting.com, there's all the social media links in there. So you can find all the direct links to the Facebook groups. And I have a YouTube channel as well. Again, youtube.com/lowcarbonfasting. So if you can support me, I'll be very grateful. Thank you very much.
Well, I think this is an important area. I think we need more people like you who can support people with diabetes, just as you had mentioned how not getting the support you needed created more anxiety in you, and that can have a cascading effect physiologically. It's good to have people out there who have good information that people can rely on. So thank you very much.
Thank you both. Thank you. It was an honor.
Thank you.
This is for general information and educational purposes only, and it's not intended to constitute or substitute for medical advice or counseling, the practice of medicine, or the provision of healthcare, or diagnosis or treatment, or the creation of a physician-patient or clinical relationship. The use of this information is at their own user's risk. If you find this to be on the value, please hit that like button to subscribe to support the work that we do on this channel. And we take your suggestions and advice very seriously, so please let us know what you'd like to see on this channel. Thanks for watching, and we hope to see you next time.